Ron Howard has always stayed calm, even when everything around him is crazy. He's a director who values respect, control, and kindness toward others. But something changed in his face when someone asked him about the ugly truth behind the business that made him who he is. He once said quietly, "You won't believe what those famous people did when no one was watching." To him, Hollywood's so-called golden years weren't really golden. It was a world where people stayed quiet, where cruelty was normal, and where people were used badly. It was a place where being famous meant you could get away with anything. The same movie stars who created America's favorite dreams also ruined many lives when nobody was looking. Now, after all these years, Ron Howard is ready to tell us who they were. From the smiling masks that hid misery to the predators everyone protected, these stories get darker with each revelation. Mickey Rooney, the smile that lied. If you thought Hollywood's golden age was all joy and innocence, Mickey Rooney's story will shatter that illusion. To Ron Howard, Rooney showed that charm could hide cruelty. For Howard, who grew up watching Rooney's cheerful musicals on late-night TV, discovering who he truly was came as a shock. Howard said once, he was the face of joy, but behind that smile was misery, and worse, he spread it to others. He was born Joseph Ewell, Jr. in 1920. Mickey Rooney was Hollywood's first real child superstar. By the time he turned 18, he was the highest-paid actor in America. MGM built an empire on his smile. He was the all-American boy, singing and dancing his way into hearts. But fame at that level twisted him early on. He got married 8 times. He cheated constantly. He gambled away millions of dollars. He humiliated the people who loved him. His ex-wife, Ava Gardner, called him the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world. Behind closed doors, the darkness got worse. In 2011, his 8th wife, Jan Chamberlain, and his stepson were accused of elder abuse and stealing his money. They drained Rooney's bank accounts while keeping him away from family. But decades before that happened, the damage Rooney caused to others was already well known. Former co-stars described him as unpredictable and cruel. Judy Garland was his closest friend during the MGM years. She once said privately, "He could make you laugh one moment and destroy you the next." Studio bosses and emotionally broken pressured Garland. Later, she hinted that Rooney, not just the executives, shared the blame for her suffering. By the 1960s, his career fell apart. Addiction, bankruptcy, and scandal followed him everywhere. In a 1979 interview, Rooney claimed, "I've lived 1,000 lives." But as Ron Howard later thought about it, he said Rooney lived all those lives for himself. Even when he got old, Rooney's bitterness never went away. He blamed everyone, studios, wives, even God, for his downfall. When he died in 2014 at 93 years old, his estate was worth less than $20,000. His body wasn't claimed by anyone at first. Eventually, he was buried in Los Angeles after friends raised money for a simple funeral. For Howard, Rooney's story showed how Hollywood's golden age used smiles as masks. Howard said, "He made the world laugh while he was dying inside." And maybe that's the saddest evil of all, when pain turns into performance and no one notices. But the tragedy of hidden pain was only the beginning. The darkness would get much worse.
Roman Polanski, The Exile of Shame. For Ron Howard, the name Roman Polanski showed the one truth Hollywood never wanted to face, that brilliance can exist alongside evil. Howard once admitted, "I admired his films before I knew who he really was. Then I realized talent doesn't excuse a person. Sometimes it just hides them." Polanski's rise to fame was incredibly fast. He was born in Paris in 1933 to Polish parents. He survived Nazi occupation and seemed marked for tragedy long before becoming famous. His breakthrough films, Knife in the Water and Rosemary's Baby, made critics see him as a genius. He was a visionary who turned paranoia into poetry. But the darkness in his movies wasn't made up. It reflected who he was. In March 1977, the illusion broke completely. Polanski was arrested for sexually assaulting a 13-year-old girl named Samantha Geimer. This happened after a photo shoot at Jack Nicholson's Los Angeles home. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Polanski admitted guilt to having unlawful sex with a minor. Before they could sentence him, he ran away to France and never came back to the United States. Hollywood split into two groups. Some people condemned him, others defended him as a troubled artist. For Howard, who was a young filmmaker then, watching people's reactions was devastating. He said years later, they talked about art while a child's life was broken. Polanski, living in exile, became one of Hollywood's greatest moral stains. He kept directing movies in other countries. He won an Oscar in 2003 for The Pianist. Howard described that moment as surreal and sickening. When the audience at the Dolby Theater stood up and clapped, Howard refused to stand. He said, "I thought of that girl alone at 13 and how that applause must sound to her." Even decades later, the industry's willingness to separate genius from guilt made him furious. When Polanski won France's César Award in 2020, protesters walked out. To Howard, that moment showed justice arriving late, but not too late. He told Vanity Fair in 2021, "It took the world 40 years to say what should have been said the next day, that a monster doesn't become less monstrous because he can frame a shot well." Polanski stays free in Europe, untouchable but haunted. His name means hypocrisy. For Howard, his story represents everything that poisoned the Golden Age, a system that protects the artist and abandons the victim. He once said bitterly, "Hollywood forgives anything as long as the lighting's good." And if you thought that was the worst Hollywood protected, the hatred runs even deeper.
John Wayne, the tyrant of the West. Very few people stood as tall in Hollywood as John Wayne did. To millions of people, he was America itself, the brave cowboy, the soldier, the tough man. But to Ron Howard, who watched him on old black-and-white TV growing up, the truth behind that tough image was much darker. Howard once thought back and said, "When I learned what he was really like, I stopped seeing the hero. I saw the bully who used his country like a costume." He was born Marion Morrison in 1907 in Iowa. Wayne became successful through the movie studio system by showing an image of unshakable toughness. By the 1950s, he was more than just an actor. He was like an idea people believed in. He saw anyone who disagreed as weak. He saw progress as betrayal. On movie sets, he ruled by scaring people. Workers who didn't meet what he expected got cursed at in front of everyone. Actor Christopher Mitchum said, "When Duke got angry, the air froze. You either agreed with him or you were gone." Howard later said that kind of atmosphere was the opposite of art. It was fear, pretending to be discipline. Wayne's cruelty went beyond just the workplace. People knew him for putting down women in public. He mocked Native American actors on Western movie sets. He dismissed black performers who challenged stereotypes. His 1971 Playboy interview is still one of the most disturbing records of Hollywood's golden age. In that conversation, he said that Native Americans were being selfish for keeping the land. He said black people weren't yet responsible enough to govern themselves. He said films needed men, not complainers. These statements made people angry decades later when they came back up. They showed not a patriot, but a man stuck in hate. On the set of The Searchers, Wayne fought bitterly with director John Ford. He insisted on playing Ethan Edwards, a racist, revenge-seeking Confederate, as someone to feel sorry for. Ford pushed back against this. Wayne refused to change. In the final movie, the character's cruelty came through clearly, but so did the actor's contempt. Ron Howard studied that performance later at USC Film School. He said, "It's terrifying because you can't tell where the role ends and the man begins." Even in his final years, when cancer made him weak, Wayne never said he was sorry. He called critics soft. He blamed the change in culture for why people isolated him. He died in 1979 at 72 years old. Many people still praised him as an American icon, but to filmmakers like Ron Howard, his story became a warning. It proved that power built on prejudice doesn't turn into wisdom as you age. It turns into bitterness. Howard once said, "The myth survived, but the man behind it never deserved the legend." But political hatred wasn't the only poison on Hollywood sets. Some legends wielded cruelty like a weapon.
Faye Dunaway, the queen of cruelty. If Mickey Rooney hid his darkness behind smiles and John Wayne wrapped his hate in patriotism, then Faye Dunaway represented something colder, cruelty wrapped up in beauty. To Ron Howard, she proved that evil in Hollywood didn't always come with violence. Sometimes it came through controlling others, embarrassing them, and having an ego so huge it crushed everyone nearby. She was born in 1941 in Bascom, Florida. Her rise to fame was incredibly fast. From Bonnie and Clyde in 1967 to Chinatown in 1974, she seemed like no one could touch her. She was like a goddess of movies, cold and magnetic. But behind all that talent, people across the industry whispered stories about how cruel she was. People working on sets talked about her angry outbursts, her endless demands, and how she treated her assistants like they were nothing. Her co-star and mommy dearest, Rutanya Alda, said, "You could feel everyone's fear on set. Everyone waited for her to explode." That movie was supposed to show a dark story about abuse. Instead, it became a mirror showing Dunaway herself. It's ironic. While playing Joan Crawford, a woman known for being cruel, Dunaway reportedly acted the same way. Director Frank Perry later admitted he thought about quitting because of her violent outbursts. She threw things at people. She screamed at the makeup artists. One time, she refused to film until the lighting made her look perfect. Years later, Ron Howard used her as an example of what happens when an actor's need to control things turns into emotional terrorism. The stories kept coming. During The Wicked Lady, people said Dunaway slapped a cameraman and spat on a crew member. On Don Juan DeMarco, she supposedly humiliated assistants so badly that they stopped filming for a whole day. Her former manager, Jay Bernstein, said, "Faye doesn't just play divas in movies, she becomes them in real life." By the 2000s, her reputation caught up with her. Hollywood stopped giving her work. Directors refused to work with her. They said she was impossible to manage. In 2011, she got fired from a Broadway play called Tea at 5. Dunaway blamed everyone except herself. When a journalist asked Ron Howard about what she left behind, his answer was polite but harsh. He said she chased perfection so hard that she forgot about being kind. Dunaway's fall from fame wasn't quick. It happened slowly over time. The woman who once ruled Hollywood ended up alone. People avoided her even at events celebrating her own movies. For Howard, she showed what cruelty costs a person. She was a warning that talent without caring about others will eventually destroy itself. He once said, "People talk about power, but in Hollywood, power without kindness turns into poison." But if you thought controlling and humiliating people was bad, the violence only intensifies from here. Kirk Douglas, the man who never stopped fighting. To Ron Howard, Kirk Douglas showed the perfect opposite sides of Hollywood's golden age. He was someone who talked about doing right and being fair in movies while spreading fear and shame when the camera stopped. He was born Isur Danielovich in 1916 to poor parents who came from another country. Douglas escaped poverty by being incredibly tough and determined. After Spartacus made him world famous, he had everything: fame, wealth, and people's respect. But the people who worked with him remembered something darker. He had a violent temper that stayed with him even after filming ended. Workers on set said Douglas was impossible to make happy. He would explode with anger and make people cry. Actress Deborah Paget said he didn't just want to be the best in a scene, he wanted to control everyone around him. Howard studied Douglas's acting when he was a young filmmaker. Later, he said, "There's anger hiding under that smile, the kind that destroys a person from the inside." That anger stayed with Douglas his whole career. People in Hollywood have quietly talked for years about how he treated women. People who wrote about his life and others who knew things have pointed to his part in raping a young actress named Natalie Wood in the 1950s when she was only 16. This claim came up after Wood died. Her sister Lana wrote about it in her book in 2018. Douglas was never arrested for it. The story got buried by the same system that protected many powerful men back then. Even after he died in 2020, at 103 years old, people started talking about it again. This time it wasn't just gossip. It was people demanding answers. On movie sets, he could make people feel inspired and terrified at the same time. Stanley Kubrick directed him in 2 movies and called him the most driven person he ever met and the hardest one to control. Ron Howard once thought about what Douglas's career really taught us. It wasn't about being talented or famous. It was about power. Douglas believed rules didn't apply to him, and Hollywood let him think that. When Douglas got a special Oscar in 1996, many people saw an old man looking for peace. But Howard saw something else, the final performance of someone who spent his life running from his own problems. Under all the clapping was a truth Hollywood never wanted to admit. Some of its biggest stars built their success not on being brilliant, but on making people afraid. And at the top of that pyramid of fear was perhaps the darkest figure of them all.
Errol Flynn, the devil who smiled. Before James Bond or Jack Sparrow existed, there was Errol Flynn. He was the daring hero who showed off charm, excitement, and wild passion. On the movie screen, he played the perfect adventure hero. When the cameras turned off, he was more like a dangerous hunter. He was born in 1909 in Tasmania and came to Hollywood in the 1930s. He became instantly famous after making Captain Blood in 1935. The movie studios made huge money from his charm, but under all that polish was a man filled with pride and dependent on drugs. His good name turned bad by 1942. 2 teenage girls named Peggy Satterley and Betty Hansen said Flynn forced himself on them sexually. The court case was in every newspaper and split America into 2 sides. Flynn laughed while people testified against him. He treated the charges like a joke, acting like being a star made him above the law. Warner Bros. Paid for expensive lawyers. His fans waited outside the courthouse. Studio bosses secretly paid people with information to disappear. The jury said he was not guilty. But after that, his actions got even worse. Private letters that came out in 1978 showed Flynn bragging about the women he slept with. He made fun of women who were scared of him. Ron Howard said that reading about this trial changed everything for him. He realized Hollywood would protect terrible people as long as they looked good on camera. The public still saw Flynn as a troublemaker with style. People on the inside knew he was a lesson about what not to become. Drinking, cocaine, and money problems destroyed him. In 1959, when he was only 50, his body gave out in Vancouver after years of hurting himself. The doctors who examined his body said he died from heart failure, liver disease, and stomach problems. But Howard saw it differently. He said Flynn died the way he lived his life, taking everything from others and giving nothing back. Flynn's story became the ultimate example of how Hollywood lost its way. It showed that being charming can cover up being cruel. It proved that fame doesn't save anyone in the end.
For Ron Howard, these stories were never about getting revenge. They were warnings. From the smiling lies to the predatory evil, each story reveals how Hollywood's golden age wasn't made of gold at all. It was built on silence, using people badly, and broken lives hidden behind fame. And as he once said, the scariest monsters aren't in horror films. They're the ones the spotlight protects. These 6 names are just the beginning. Hollywood's history is filled with countless others who used their power to hurt people and got away with it. The system that protected them still exists today in different forms. But now people are speaking up. Victims are being heard, and the silence that once covered these crimes is finally breaking. Ron Howard's willingness to name these legends wasn't about destroying their legacy, it was about telling the truth. Because when we refuse to look at the darkness, we allow it to continue. When we separate the art from the artist without any accountability, we tell future victims that fame matters more than justice. And that's a lesson Hollywood can no longer afford to teach. The golden age may be over, but its lessons remain. Power without accountability destroys. Talent without humanity corrupts. And silence in the face of evil makes us all responsible. So which of these 6 actors shocked you the most? The smiling liar? The protected criminal? The hateful icon? The cruel perfectionist? The violent tyrant? Or the charming predator? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this video eye-opening, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from Hollywood's dark history. Share this video with someone who needs to hear the truth behind the legends, because the more we talk about these stories, the harder it becomes for history to repeat itself. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.